Okie dokie. So we have been talking about all of these chemicals getting into the environment. And we've talked a little bit now about what it is that the environment does generally, and so why we should care that things are getting into the environment. And so I thought we would now spend a little bit of time talking about how we as a society attempt to manage the environment, which is a monumental task in and of itself. And so I wanted to focus a little bit on kind of the government infrastructure that helps us navigate our interactions with the environment. Okay, so I wanted to, so this lecture is basically organized to go through the parts of our government. So hopefully everyone remembers from high school civics, we have a tripart government, right? We have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch. And all three of those branches are going to interact with our environment in some way, shape, or form. So I thought we would go through those three branches and how they interact. And I wanted to start with an overview of laws and policies, because laws and policies are words and phrases, they get tossed around a lot, and they often get used in very similar and confusing ways. And so I wanted to try and dissect that a little bit to help us understand what our various government aspects are doing. So to begin with, a policy. So when a governmental body says this is our policy, that policy is a set of objectives. And they usually say we're going to try and achieve these objectives in some certain amount of time, within the next year, within the next 10 years, etc. As part of those policies, there's usually a framework given to help guide how we're going to accomplish these objectives in X time. And especially in terms of environmental policy, these are often accompanied by various rules that are designed to help the individuals in our society and the other private sectors in our society navigate ways in which they should behave that are going to help the government overall achieve those policies. So we can have policies saying we want to have safe air, we want to have safe water, we want to have safe food, that the policies say that we should have access to public land, things like that. All right, so policies are, they're great, and they give us structure and they give us goals and deadlines, which everyone loves a good deadline. But they're not very hard and fast in terms of, well, what happens if you don't follow this policy, if you don't follow that guideline? And that's where laws come in. So laws are the tools that are going to be the stick behind the carrot that is a policy. So laws are the tools that are going to help a government achieve those objectives. Policies are often drafted after laws are passed. So the law usually comes first, and then the policies help guide how we are going to follow the law. Again, these laws come along with standard rules and regulations that are compulsory and are to be followed by people, however the law defines people of the country. We can generally split our laws into two basic flavors. Two basic flavors of laws are proscriptive and prescriptive. Proscriptive laws are laws that say do not do a particular action. So murder is a proscriptive law. Don't murder. We're not supposed to do that. Prescriptive are you must do a particular action. You must stop at a stop sign. You must pay taxes, right? These are compulsory things you must do. So generally, our laws fall into those two camps. Things you can't do, must never do, things you must do, always do. All right, everybody good? Okay. So, how do we come to understand what the role of the federal government is in our environment? And I'm really going to focus on the federal level. We're not going to delve too much into state or local municipalities. We're going to stay very high level with our federal government. So there are a few places in our Constitution that have been interpreted to give the federal government jurisdiction over the environment. Many of them come to us from Article 1 in various sections. So first one is the section 8.3 to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Basically, what this article is saying is that the federal government is the arbiters of our interactions, i.e. commerce. So when you hear folks referring to the Commerce Clause, this is the Commerce Clause. Federal government, it's the federal government's job to be that interaction or to guide the interactions between and among states, how the whole country negotiates and interacts with other countries, etc. That's that Commerce Clause. Additionally, further on in Article 9, we've got that no preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over another state. Basically, no favoritism. So the federal government cannot pass some specific law saying, California, your gas sucks, you must do this. And this law only applies, we, the federal government, say this law only applies to California. Can't do that. If the federal government is going to make some law, it has to apply to all of the states. It can't pick and choose. So there's no favoritism. There's no particular punishment that we can inflict on certain states. The law applies equally to all the states. If a state then violates said law, then there are consequences specific to that state. Not all the states are punished when one state violates the law, but all of the laws apply equally to all states. All right, so we're gonna manage the commerce, the interactions between those states. We're not gonna play favoritism. So that's where we begin our legislative journey. All right, everybody good here? All right, so as you might recall, the way in which we get laws is we start with a bill on Capitol Hill that gets signed or that gets passed by Congress, both houses of Congress, and then it ultimately goes to the president's desk for signage, and then it is an official law. So it has to be agreed upon by both legislative and executive branches in order to become a law. We have lots of laws in this country regarding our environment. We're going to talk about some of the major ones. And the one that I posted to Blackboard, that it's only like, for as important as it is, it's shockingly short. It's only like 5 pages, 4 pages. It's not really that long. But it is the National Environmental Policy Act from 1970. So Congress worked on it, passed it in 1969-ish, and finally made it to Nixon's desk in 1970, and Nixon signed it. So I wanted to start with the National Environmental Policy because it has become the kind of umbrella law that really organizes the rest of our laws. Even though a lot of our environmental laws came before the NEPA, the NEPA is kind of the big umbrella that collects together and really enforces a lot of our environmental laws. So there were a number of purposes that the NEPA hoped to achieve. First was to eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, enrich our understanding of ecological systems, and to establish a council on environmental quality. And this is where we learned that a lot of environmentalists and ecologists have a secret soft spot for Nixon, because as much of a big business weirdo kind of guy that Nixon was, you know, we can credit Nixon with the establishment of the EPA. Like, the EPA has become this special whipping child for some reason, and yet it was a Republican president who established it, and many, many other environmental laws. And so I particularly like this quote from Nixon on the occasion of the signing of the National Environmental Policy, that the 70s must absolutely be the years where America pays its debt to our past by reclaiming the purity of its air, its waters, and our living environment. Because there was a lot of nasty environmental stuff that was going on in the country around this time. If you ever just Google photos of New York City before the EPA, and it is really a disaster. I remember when I was first moving to New York City, and I told my dad, and he was like, "You're gonna die," because he had driven through New York City in the 60s when there were literal tire fires everywhere. And you could do that in New York City, and you could do that in New Jersey. And you can't do that anymore just about anywhere. And it's because of laws like the NEPA that you can't do that. So Nixon really got it all started with this law. So let's look at these three main purposes. Okay, so to make sure that the NEPA was going to do its job, we first had to declare a national environmental policy. And there were lots of points to this environmental policy. I've listed really sort of two here that are the most important, I think. So first of all, our environmental policy states that the government is going to be a trustee of the environment for succeeding generations. The NEPA says that the government is going to take care of the environment so that our descendants have a good, healthy, clean place to live. The ultimate purpose of the NEPA, it's the National Environmental Policy Act, and so we think, oh, it's about the environment, but really it's for us. It's making sure that we're not living in a toxic environment. That's the goal of the NEPA. And so everything that the NEPA does is with an eye mainly towards human health. How are we doing? How is the environment affecting us? So first and foremost, it says that the government is going to be a trustee for the environment for succeeding generations. And it is going to ensure that all Americans are safe and healthy in their environment, and lots of other details besides. And it further goes on to say in this declaration of our national environmental policy that, I don't know why I had just that little bit covered up, but whatever. The policies, regulations, and public laws of the United States shall be interpreted and administered in accordance with the policies set forth in this act. So what this sentence here is saying is all the laws that currently exist, they now have to be re-examined in the context of making sure that we have a safe and healthy environment for the current generation and every generation that comes after, is what this sentence is meant to imply. Some of the things that were happening prior to the signage of the 1970 National Environmental Policy Act, the Cuyahoga River. So this is a picture of the Cuyahoga River. This is the river that flows through Cleveland. Has anybody here driven through Cleveland? Handful of folks. If you stay on, I believe it's Interstate 90, it kind of winds through a very industrial part of Cleveland through a lot of oil refineries. And they are still active and still doing their thing. And before the NEPA was signed, there was no law, there were very few laws really dictating how companies like oil refineries were meant to deal with the waste product of the oil refining process. And until that point, a lot of that waste went into the Cuyahoga River, which ultimately ended up in Lake Erie. And so this is one of the more famous photos of the Cuyahoga River on fire. It's not the only time the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. It caught on fire a couple of times, but this was the photo that sort of made Time magazine that year. And people were like, whoa, wait, there's a whole river that's actually catching fire? That's not good. And it started to awaken people to that. And so that's when we started to be like, we should do something about what's going on here. All right, everybody good? Okay, what else does the NEPA do? So the NEPA also states that everything that the federal government does, and anybody who works for the federal government, anything you do needs an environmental impact statement. How is what action you're about to undertake going to affect the environment? And typical environmental impact statements have 5 parts: impact of the proposed action, the environmental effects which cannot be avoided. Are there any alternatives? Are you going to use those alternatives? Are you not? Why are you going to not? What are the short-term and long-term effects of maintenance, and any irreversible or irretrievable commitments of resource? So just as an example here, I've got the environmental impact statement for the Cassini mission. You can see that this was stamped 1994. And this was the satellite Cassini. This is a satellite. It's going to be in outer space. Why does it need an environmental impact statement? Mainly because of point number 5. right? This is going into space. We're never getting it back. Does anybody know what we did with our Cassini satellite? We crashed it into Saturn. We literally threw it at Saturn. It orbited Saturn for a number of years, taking some of the most detailed photos we ever had of Saturn. And then there were some instruments on board that were going to analyze Saturn's atmosphere. The only way to analyze Saturn's atmosphere was to crash into Saturn. So we're never getting this back. All of these components, all of these rare earth metals, all of the gold, all of the silica, all of the carbon, all of the oil, all of the nuclear powered batteries that are in this, not getting it back. So we had to talk about environmental effects, which cannot be avoided, right? We had to launch this thing. That cost a lot of rocket fuel to launch this thing into space. We have to talk about that. Can't be avoided. Are there any alternatives for launching it into space? Nope. Got to do it on a rocket using rocket fuel. Catapults don't work. Short-term, long-term effects of maintenance, right? This had to be built in a very clean facility. So you had to talk about what was the upkeep of those facilities, how much energy does it cost to maintain those facilities, all that kind of jazz. And then irreversible and irretrievable commitments of resources, we can't recycle any of this because it's going to be on Saturn. All right. All right, so then what else does the NEPA do? So the NEPA says that we need this Council on Environmental Quality. All right, so we have this Council of Environmental Quality. What is the Council on Environmental Quality going to do? It's going to prepare a regular environmental quality report that it gives to the president. It is going to gather and interpret authoritative information about conditions and trends to ensure policy goals are met. It is going to develop and recommend policies based on this information. And it is going to conduct investigation studies, surveys, research, and analyses relating to ecological systems and environmental quality. If this seems like a lot for a council to do, you are correct. This is a lot for a council to do. And so one of the first things that this council did was say, this is way too much, for just one group of people to do, especially this point number 5. We can't do all this. So we'll prepare the report. We'll prepare that report by gathering information. And as we gather that information, we'll develop and recommend policies that we'll put into our report. All that's good. Clearly there was a number 3 here at some point that got deleted. I'm just noticing. But then this point number 4/5, conduct all these investigation studies, surveys, research, and analyses. We can't do that. We need another thing to do that. And it is this particular piece. So this last point of the Council of the Environmental Quality Act inside the National Environmental Policy Act, this is the piece of legislation that created the Environmental Protection Agency. We have the EPA because of the Council of Environmental Quality, which is one of the cornerstones of the National Environmental Policy Act. And so it's the EPA. And so the EPA is basically the structure that now houses the Council of Environmental Quality. So the Council on Environmental Quality kind of lives as overseer of the EPA. So whenever you hear the EPA says we're going to do X, it's not exactly the EPA saying that. It's the Council of Environmental Quality saying that through the EPA, which has done all the studies and the surveys and the research and compiled everything and gathered, interpreted, and authoritative to help them prepare their quality report. Yes, question. Yes. So So I think a good analogy for this is, okay, so you have the EPA as the main focus organization, and we still have the Council on Environmental Quality. They still exist. And they, in their relation to the EPA, is they're very much like the board of directors, like how Damon has a board of directors. There's a group of senior folks who sit around and make a lot of the kind of high level decisions about, whether or not we're going to change our name from college to university, for example, right? The board of trustees handles a lot of those things. What are we going to name that building? The board of trustees decides those things. These really big sort of actions that affect the whole university. So actions that affect the whole of what the EPA does, those actions have to come from the Council of Environmental Quality. But the council is going to make their decrees based on the information that they gather and interpret to develop policies that they got from doing all the studies that the EPA does. Does that make sense? So it's a little circular, but this Council of Environmental Quality is still kind of the overseer of the EPA. But there's so much that this council has to do that it can't make any of those decisions without the EPA doing the things to backfill all of the knowledge that the council needs. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so then when we get these kinds of decrees, so this is Tuesday. This was Tuesday. New rule come down from the EPA. The US has 10 years to replace all its lead pipes. That's the new rule that the council is saying based on all of the information gathered, all of the studies done by the EPA. So we now have this new rule in place. They've been haggling and negotiating the language of what this rule is going to look like to make sure that all the parties are sufficiently grumbly, but will still comply, right? Because that's the goal of compromise, that everyone's a little bit unhappy. So everyone's a little bit unhappy about this happening because it is going to cost money, but there is, you can't have a rule with no funding to do it. And so there is funding to do this, part of the funding that was in the Infrastructure Act that was passed in 22. So that funding is there. Communities are now in the process of doing an initial inventory of remaining lead pipes, is where the first step of this new rule is going to be enacted. So in about 2 months, we're expecting a national report on just how much of our water infrastructure is lead pipes. And then once we get that national inventory of just how much of our water infrastructure is lead pipes, then we can start to figure out, well, how much does it cost to replace them here? How much does it cost to replace them there? Start figuring out those costs. Start doing some of that work in places where it's cheaper, write more legislation to get more funding in places where it's more. We've got 10 years to do that, because based on all of the evidence, the existence of lead pipes in our water infrastructure is so hazardous to human health that we got to get them out. There's no skirting around this anymore. We've been trying to, encourage municipalities to get funding to replace them, and encouragement and suggestion and please do this has not worked. And so now it's a rule. Got to do it. All right. So this was yesterday, and I posted this on our news list, so you can go listen to this anytime you like. Okay, so that's our main piece of legislature that really ties everything together. It's the National Environmental Act. Once Congress passes those laws, a lot of these environmental laws contain language that says, and we'll see some of this language as we go through some of these other laws. It contains language that says the power to do what this law says needs to be done, we are now delegating to various agencies. Those agencies, like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, those agencies are housed under the executive branch. So, if you recall, we have our 3 branches, right? Legislative, executive, judicial. So the legislature passes the laws, and part of the passing of the laws says, okay, we've passed the law. Now, executive, you do the law. So the executive does the law that the legislature passed. As part of the executive, the doing the law, the executive branch has agencies like the EPA. The EPA is, of course, not our only agency that is that works in our environment. We have a number of agencies, and just a few of them are listed here. And actually, the EPA is the youngest of all of those agencies. It's the most famous. It's the one that gets the most attention because the NEPA gives it such broad authority and kind of ties everybody else together. But there are all of these other agencies that exist to help us manage our environment. Let's see. So we have all these agencies. We'll talk about them in a minute. In addition to agencies enacting the rules that the legislature passes for the executive branch, The executive branch itself can just make rules. These are the executive decrees, I forget the formal word for them. Candidates are always sniping at each other about them, and I've forgotten the word. But those executive decrees that presidents can pass and just make up on their own. They don't need Congress in order to pass an executive rule. So just as an example, Clinton passed an executive rule that protected 58 square miles of 58 million acres, I'm sorry, that's what I mean there, 58 million acres of wilderness. And then Bush came along and issued an executive rule that overturned Clinton's executive rule. And then Obama came along and issued an executive rule that overturned Bush's executive rule, which had overturned Clinton's, which basically reestablished Clinton's, right? So it'll go back and forth like that. And if you watch the news for these various executive policies, especially when there's a turnover in administration, there's usually a flurry of these executive rules that come out that undo a lot of things that the previous president had done. And that's just kind of the way, that's the gambit that you take when you do these executive rules. Like, they're immediate, you can do them instantaneously, you don't need to wait for Congress to get its act together. But if you pass some executive rule and then you leave office, it can just be undone immediately. So that's kind of the consequence. All right, so these agencies. So lots of government alphabet soup, right? Every government agency loves their little acronym for themselves. Let's see, who we have here. So some of these agencies are this red castle right here. This is the Army Corps of Engineers. So the Army, the US Army, has a civilian branch that they call the engineers. And the engineers' primary job is to maintain ports and shores, to make sure that we can ship goods in, ship goods out, ship troops in, ship troops out, get munitions in, get munitions out. They're the oldest agency that deals with our environment, established before the signing of the Declaration of Independence by Continental Congress. And it was the Army Corps that really kept the Eastern Seaboard moving during the Revolutionary War. Following Army Corps of Engineers, we've got the USGS. So the USGS was founded in the late 1800s. The reason that the USGS was founded is because of the Louisiana Purchase. So the first beginnings of the USGS were with the Louisiana Purchase. It became much more official later on in 1879. But we had bought so much land with the Louisiana Purchase that we didn't know what was there. And we had to like create a whole agency to go figure out what the hell we just bought. So that's where the USGS comes from. Lincoln brings us the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture. So the US Department of Agriculture, these are the folks that make sure that your meat has been butchered in a safe and approved facility, that your fruits are free from disease when they come from overseas, that if there's any diseases in our crops, they help manage that. And so they're mainly agriculture, right? The A in the USDA stands for agriculture, but there's a lot of research that goes on around all of that to support that. So when, for example, when I showed you that picture of the cow all strapped up with equipment to measure the amount of methane that was coming out of it, a lot of that is USDA research. When you see brightly colored traps hanging in trees to monitor various insect pests, that's often the USDA that's doing that. So for example, we're currently on the lookout for spotted lanternfly as an invasive insect pest that could devastate our wine grape industry. Decimate is not a strong enough word for what the spotted lanternfly can do. It's cost millions of dollars to the wine industry in states south of us, like Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia. The spotted lanternfly is already in southern New York, sort of in the Hudson Valley-ish. I've seen scattered reports that it's in the Catskills. I've been looking for it. I haven't seen it up here yet. That doesn't mean it isn't. But the USDA is pretty soon going to be setting out traps to try and collect spotted lanternflies to monitor the spread of that insect pest, and then help come up with ways to hopefully combat it. Although so far it's proven a tough individual. Let's see. All right, so we've got USGS, USDA, U.S. Army Corps, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife helps to manage a lot of our wild animals. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is the wild animals themselves: fish, birds, bears, elk, moose, etc. Excuse me. And the U.S. Forestry Service is often where the animals that the Fish and Wildlife Service live. So Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Forestry Service often work hand in hand. Fish and Wildlife, again, is the animals, the organism, or the animals. Forestry Service is more the habitat, the planty side of things. Forestry Service is also where our park rangers tend to be housed. So a little bit more there. All right. So a lot of these are pretty old. Most of these are in the 1800s. And then EPA is kind of the newest one in the 1970s. So we've established several agencies, at least one every decade that the country has existed. Or not decade, century, every century that the country has existed. But we have quite a few of them that help us. All right, everybody okay here? All right, so what are some of these other laws that not only the EPA, but these other agencies are going to help the executive implement? So again, I mentioned we have lots of environmental laws. I just want to talk about kind of the big ones. So in addition to the National Environmental Policy Act, we have the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Air Act was the first act to standardize our rules for identification, monitoring, and gives authority to reduce air contaminants. And through the Clean Air Act, we get a number of ways in which we're going to be doing that. So we establish these national ambient air quality standards that have a whole set of criteria about what's included in them, what are the good things we're looking for, what are the bad things we're looking for. Establishing requirements for states, again, treating all the states equally. Establishment of new source performance standards for new and modified stationary sources. So this refers to, when we say sources here, we're thinking about things that are emitting things into the air, chemicals into the air. Gives us some increased authority enforcement with the 1970 law, and authorizes requirements for motor control or control of motor vehicle emissions. All right, so we do quite a lot of things with the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act kind of got its start in the 50s, and we've modified it through subsequent bills several times. Nixon, again, signed a revised version of the Clean Air Act in 1970, and there were a few more little revisions in the late 70s and again in the early 90s. All right, everybody okay here? All right, often along with the Clean Air Act comes the Clean Water Act. Similar legislation, but now for water instead of for air. So the Clean Water Act does a lot of the same things that the Clean Air Act did, but now in water. So establishing a structure for regulating pollutants, giving the EPA authority to implement pollution control programs, hence why the EPA is in charge of saying no more lead pipes. Maintaining existing requirements, making it unlawful to discharge any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters. These two words right here are the source of so much consternation in the interpretation of our national laws. Navigable waters is it's one of those phrases that Congress thought it was very, very clever when it wrote that law, because it was like, this is going to be so broad and there's going to be so many ways that this can be interpreted that it will catch all of these scenarios that we can't possibly interpret. And so the common sense interpretation of navigable waters, and how I was instructed to interpret that when I was learning this myself, was if you could put a boat, like a little canoe or a kayak, some sort of flotation vessel, in that body of water and move it some distance within the water, that counted as navigable waters. And people then took that to an extreme and asked all sorts of ridiculous questions. And they're like, so if I have a drainage ditch and you put on a little floaty and you jump in the water, Does that mean that drainage ditch is a navigable waterway? And some people just sort of stubbornly went, yeah, that's what that means. And other people were like, no, of course that's not what we meant with that. I try to stick to the navigable as in you need a boat and you need to move that boat some distance. And usually you need to be connected to other water bodies, right? So if you just have like a field, like imagine you're in Nevada, you're in a field and there is a pond barely big enough for a kayak. That's not a navigable water because you can't, you can barely fit a boat in there and it doesn't connect to literally any other water body, right? So you can't really go anywhere. But if you can go somewhere, even if it starts out this big, if you can put a kayak in it and get to something else, that counts. That's how it was meant to be interpreted. Congress thought they were very, very clever when they wrote this. And it's since gotten us into a lot of trouble, and people have come up with all sorts of strange interpretations of what navigable waters mean. One of the other very clever things that Congress thought it was doing when it established the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act is they did write in some specific compounds, like you can't put petrol in the water, you can't emit methane, you can't emit sulfur dioxide. They did have some specifics in there, but then after the specifics, it often has language something along the lines of any pollutant, because at the time, Congress realized we're not chemists. We don't know all the chemicals that are out there. We're in this strange new world of every day there's 100 new chemicals doing 1,000 different new things, and we don't know what's coming. We don't know what's going to be a pollutant 20 years in the future, 30 years in the future, 40 years in the future, and we want to make sure that we're being good stewards of the environment, protecting the environment for subsequent generations, right? All the things that Nixon said. And so they put in language like any pollutant, lots of places in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And they did that as a catch-all, to catch all the things that they didn't know. There have been recent judicial interpretations of these various laws that have said, because it wasn't explicitly said in a law, the law can't regulate it. So all of the chemicals that Congress didn't know existed in 1978 that now exist, because they weren't explicitly said, you can't regulate them with this law or any other law if they're not explicitly said. There was a recent Supreme Court decision that says that things that aren't explicitly said in a law cannot be acted upon by a governmental agency. And I forget the name of the recent Supreme Court case that was about it. It was just decided this summer. But it had the consequence of overturning a prior Supreme Court decision called the Chevron doctrine. Chevron as in the oil company, Chevron. So the little backstory of that is that back in, I want to say the 80s or 90s, I forget, oil company Chevron sued the EPA for trying to regulate Chevron on its pollution of some aspect of the environment. And the Supreme Court looked at that lawsuit and said, when these laws were written, we had no idea what was going to be there. And we have these agencies with all this expertise. We're going to make our ruling on this such that we are going to defer to the expertise of our federal agencies until the plaintiffs can show otherwise. And it really put the onus of proof on the plaintiffs, i.e. the oil companies and other agencies and other companies, to prove that the thing that the EPA or whatever was trying to regulate was not actually harmful. That's what the Chevron doctrine did. It said that our agencies, said all of our agencies, right? All of our agencies, right there, these are staffed by scientists with decades and decades and decades of knowledge, including the Army Corps, decades and decades of scientific knowledge. They know what they're doing. If they say this thing is toxic, it is up to you, person, saying no, it's not, to prove that it's not. That's what Chevron doctrine said. And there was a recent Supreme Court decision that said, nope, flip that. Because it wasn't explicitly listed in the legislature, now you, agency, have to prove that it is toxic, and you can't regulate it until you do so. which means that we're going to have a lot of lawsuits coming very soon because there's a lot of laws and regulations that these collective agencies, including the EPA, have in place based on compounds not explicitly said in the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, because they didn't list them all because they didn't know them all. And so they said any pollutant. All right. In addition to the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, we have the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, otherwise known as CERCLA. So CERCLA was passed in 1980. It was one of the last acts that Jimmy Carter passed. This is the act that created the Superfund. So whenever you hear about a Superfund, the existence of the Superfund comes to us from the CERCLA Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. What the goal of CERCLA was to, it wanted companies to list all of the toxic compounds that they were potentially going to have to dispose of. It additionally made those companies pay into a fund so that if and when those chemicals escaped their containment, there would be money to clean it up. That's the Superfund. So the Superfund was supposed to come from these companies with all of their list of chemicals so that we could clean them up. This was hopefully going to make the EPA's job easier to find responsible parties when there were chemical spills, especially if there were sort of old abandoned sites, like the case that was the inspiration and really the onus or the momentum behind the creation of the CERCLA Act. The very first Superfund site is around here. The very, very first Superfund site is around here. It's this little neighborhood in the city of Niagara Falls called Love Canal. So the Love Canal neighborhood in Niagara Falls was the very first Superfund site. It was the site that inspired and moved Congress and then Carter to sign the CERCLA Act into law, and it established the Superfund. Over the years, Love Canal has since been cleaned up. It is now off the Superfund site. It is now no longer a Superfund site. There's still concerns and worries, and I just heard a story the other day that people are still saying, no, there's still toxins here. They're still coming out of the ground. And so people who live nearby are saying that there's toxins, and the EPA and state DC are like, I don't know, man, we dug everything up. I don't think there's anything there anymore. And so there's this whole kind of back and forth going on right now where people are saying it's not cleaned up, and the government says, no, it is cleaned up. But one of the consequences of the CERCLA Act is that most congressionals, most Congresses since then have, in subsequent laws, other unrelated laws, written in exemptions to companies having to pay into the Superfund. So the Superfund is no longer funded anymore. And so we keep adding sites to the Superfund, but there is no longer a whole lot of money to help clean up those Superfund sites. And so they just kind of stay on the Superfund list for forever. Usually we have to wait for money from other pieces of legislation to help clean up Superfund sites. So for example, up near me in Niagara County, there is currently some Superfund mitigation going on for 18 Mile Creek. So 18 Mile Creek has its headwaters underneath the Erie Canal. And in the early days of the Erie Canal, in the early 1900s, there were a lot of chemical manufacturing companies in Lockport that were doing things with lead and PCBs, namely, and letting that wash into the Erie Canal and then ultimately into 18 Mile Creek. And so now it's been declared a Superfund site, and they're now finally getting around to cleaning it up. And the funds that are going to clean up that Superfund site are coming from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. So there wasn't any more Superfund funds to clean up the Superfund site. We had to get those funds, from another piece of legislation. All right, so we've got NEPA, clean air, clean water, CERCLA, and last but not least, one of the big major laws that we're going to talk about is the ESA. The ESA is the Endangered Species Act, one of the last acts signed by Nixon, 1973. In 2010, there were almost 2,000 species listed on it. 750 of which are plants. We often don't think of plants as being endangered, but the plants can be endangered. Once you get on the endangered species list, according to the guidelines set forth in the Endangered Species Act, not all species on the list are strictly endangered. There are actually 3 categories specified by the Endangered Species Act. Those categories are vulnerable, threatened, and then finally endangered. So endangered is the most limited. The fewest numbers are left when you get to be endangered. You are vulnerable when your numbers start to really decline. One of our most recent additions to the endangered species list is the migratory monarch. So migratory monarchs are a subgroup within monarch butterflies. So monarch butterflies themselves as a whole are still considered a species of least concern, meaning that they have enough numbers to reproduce. We're not worried about them. So least concern doesn't mean they're garbage species. It just means we're not worried about them. But the migratory species in particular have been moved to the vulnerable category. The migratory subgroup of monarchs is considered vulnerable mainly due to loss of habitat. So we all sort of know and grow up learning that monarchs need milkweed plants in order to lay their eggs. Caterpillars have something to eat. Due to lots of development, right, building of housing subdivisions, building of roads, building of parking lots, shopping centers, etc. Lots of milkweed habitat is being bulldozed and transformed into housing development, shopping centers, parking lots, etc. So there's a big movement nationwide to plant more milkweed in all sorts of places so that there is habitat available for migratory monarch butterflies to lay their eggs along the way, because it's a multi-generational trip for a monarch to migrate from Canada to their wintering grounds in Mexico. It takes them several generations. Those several generations happen over the course of like 1 year for us, but it's still several generations. The other big part of habitat loss that migratory monarchs are experiencing is in their wintering grounds in Mexico. The trees that the migratory monarchs live in during the winter are in a part of Mexico that is experiencing a lot of drug cartel violence, and they're often cut down, damaged, set on fire. Large numbers of monarchs are killed fairly regularly in those cartel drug wars. So that's a huge place where migratory monarchs are losing out on their habitat also. And unfortunately, there's not enough milkweed that we can plant to compensate for that. All right, so there are a number of other laws, and I had this idea that we would sort of take a moment to, I don't know, find out some fun facts. So, but I think there's still enough slides that we need to get through that I'm not quite sure we have time for this. So let's just say here for these slides, or for this slide, choose one of these acts to know some things about. Let's say choose one of these, choose anyone you want. I don't care. I just circled random ones. All right, so choose any act you like, know something about it, be able to maybe compare and contrast it to one of our major laws, right? So either the NEPA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, CERCLA, endangered species. And we'll call that good. Does that sound okay? Okay. Yes. All right. Is that okay here? Okay. All right. So we have all these laws that the executive ultimately gives us. How, again, are these laws passed? Well, the legislative branch does that. So the legislative branch is going to establish the laws, which they call statutes. Each statute, each law can be extremely narrow or broad. So something like the Environmental Protection Act is extremely broad. Something like, I'll come back to this, I promise, something like the Coastal Zone Management Act is going to be a little bit more narrow, right? So when we say narrow or broad, we're talking about sort of the scope of what is intended to be accomplished by any given piece of legislation. There are always lots and lots of people involved in the creation of a law. So usually some congressional person, either in the House or the Senate, has to propose it. They often work with their various staffers to look at other laws to see where are the holes in those laws that we want our law to fill. They will often consult with other professionals related to that topic. So especially in environmental laws, they're going to consult with other scientists. They might consult with other lobbying groups. So lobbying groups for the oil companies, or lobbying groups for the Nature Conservancy, or lobbying groups for certain towns and municipalities might have specific lobbying groups. So for example, the Adirondacks might have a specific lobbying group that they send to Washington very regularly to advocate for laws that are going to help protect the way of life in the Adirondacks. I don't know that they have a lobbying group, but they don't, should. So there can be all sorts of lobbyists, there can be all sorts of experts, and there can be all sorts of congressional folks and staffers and interns working on these laws before the full text is then brought before Congress or the House and then ultimately voted on. Oftentimes, as laws are being written, right, like, so some senator will announce, we're going to write a law about X, Y, and Z, and they'll send out a tweet about that, and then local newspapers will pick up that tweet and say, they're going to write this law that's going to ruin our way of life in town A. And so then constituents in town A call into that congressperson's office and say, no, don't ruin our way of life. Or, yes, this is going to be great for us. Please do this, right? Encourage you to do that. Laws, once the law has been submitted to Congress for everyone to read and then ultimately vote on, these laws are always available for public view, both before they are voted on and after they are voted on. There are two websites that really house a lot of our laws. So thomas.gov is the general congressional legal website. Specifically for the EPA, you can go to their laws and regs website there. Once you're on the Thomas website, so this is a little glimpse into what Thomas looks like, you can search for any laws having to do with whatever keyword you might be interested in. So this is from a few years ago now, but I just did a search for environmental, and you can see that there are a number of laws coming up related to various things, environmental things. So, excuse me, for example, this. So SJ stands for Senate Joint Session. So Senate Joint Resolution number 21. This is a joint resolution between House of Representatives and Senate, but it was submitted through the Senate rather than the House of Representatives by Mr. Toomey from Ohio, I believe. I want to say Ohio, but I'm not 100% about that. But so Mr. Toomey is going to introduce the following resolution before the Committee on Environment and the Public Works. And he wants this resolution to say that Congress disapproves of the rule submitted by the EPA relating to cross-state air pollution rule update for the 2008 ozone national air, I forgot what the other A stands for, quality standards, Federal Regulation 81, number blah, 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 such have no rule in effect. So this was submitted. I don't remember if it was actually passed or not. But this was a rule. This was a rule that was stating that if state A is producing some pollutant that is drifting into and affecting state B, can't do that. Which sort of makes sense, right? Like you can do whatever you want to yourself, but as soon as you start doing that to other entities like neighboring states, you can't do that. So the EPA issued a rule that said you can't pollute other states. With your pollution, you can't, discharge it to other states so that it looks like your state isn't doing the polluting. And Mr. Toomey didn't like that rule, and so wanted it officially noted that he did not like it and wanted it to not be in effect. So that's just that's an example of the kind of things that are going to come up through all of this. National Ambient Air Quality. Thank you. It's too many A's, too many words that begin with A. All right, everybody okay here? Okay. All right, so I wanted to kind of finish up with the effects of the judiciary. And these are new updated slides. These are on Blackboard now. I realize these are different than the slides that you might have already had. But I thought these were more pertinent because they were more recent. And I have them here to demonstrate the power that the judicial branch of our government does have in our environmental laws. So I have here two cases from the Supreme Court. They're not that many years apart. This one is from 2019, and the next one is from, I believe, 2022. Both of them are aquatic in nature, which is how they came to my attention. And they both have to do with this idea of navigable waters. Right, so there's navigable waters once again, rearing its head. So in 2019, this case came before the Supreme Court. So what this case was about, this is this is County of Maui versus the Hawaii Wildlife Fund. And what's happening in this case is the County of Maui, which is the whole island, they have a wastewater treatment plant here. And just down the hill from that wastewater treatment plant is this hotel and resort and this other hotel and resort. And these hotels and resorts, they're along the shore here, and they have all sorts of coral reefs along this part. And they were claiming through the Hawaii Wildlife Fund that the coral reefs here were being damaged by leakage from the wastewater treatment plant, that there was leakage and toxins coming from this wastewater treatment plant, and it was traveling through groundwater to get to and ultimately come out into the ocean. And so this groundwater, clearly groundwater is not a navigable water, right? You can't put your boat in an aquifer and go anywhere because it's underground. But it is moving water that does connect to navigable waters. There's absolutely no question that the ocean is considered navigable waters. And so what the main question was in this case, so this is the main bit that they start with. So they talk about any addition of any pollutant from any point source. So they're saying that this wastewater treatment facility, this is our point source. And we're saying any addition of pollutant without a permit, right? So this wastewater treatment plant does not have a permit to dump their waste into the ocean, right? They're supposed to treat the waste and keep it there. And we are now reviewing this, this point source and its pollution in the context of navigable waters and a recent addition to the idea of navigable waters called the significant nexus. So the significant nexus rule comes to us from an Obama era piece of legislation that stated that even if you have some specific non-navigable waterway, it could be connected to a navigable waterway through unseen water channels like groundwater, right? So we have here this wastewater treatment, and contaminants from the wastewater treatment are making it through groundwater to a very clearly, not in any question, navigable water. And so the question is this distance a significant nexus? Does this demonstrate a significant nexus? Is the groundwater functionally one into navigable water? This is the majority opinion, and this is the thing that they are really asking, is this happening? And the Supreme Court, if you read through the whole abstract, they ultimately say yes. The groundwater connecting the wastewater facility to the clearly navigable water of the Pacific Ocean, that constitutes a significant nexus. So this demonstrates a significant nexus connecting a navigable water to some other non-navigable water, meaning that the non-navigable water is under the purview of the Clean Water Act because they're connected. Even though you can't see it, they're still connected. So the Supreme Court said, yes, that's happening here. EPA has oversight. You can't pollute. And just for shits and giggles, I measured the distance. So this distance from this wastewater treatment facility to the shore That distance is 2,900 feet. That's all it takes for a significant nexus. All right, so that's one case. So this was 2019. And then we go just a few years later to 2022. And this is the case of Sackett versus the EPA. Anybody here hear about Sackett? So this was a big one. So again, we are looking at the Clean Water Act and whether or not the Clean Water Act is going to prohibit the pollution or destruction of the waters of the United States, i.e. navigable waters. And so they say, we understand that navigable waters are these kinds of water bodies. We're cool with that. But we're not cool with this idea of significant nexus. So what this Supreme Court is saying just 3 years later is that if you have, so we're now here in these wetlands, and we're going to this lake. This is a big lake, very clearly navigable waters. And what these folks did is they had this wetland here, and they filled it in so that it wasn't a wetland anymore because they wanted more stable ground to build a big house on. That's what they did. And the EPA said, you just destroyed a wetland, this wetland that is connected to this water. You can even kind of see, here's some more of that wetland behind. So this wetland was part of this wetland until they built this road. And this wetland very clearly has water that flows and connects to that lake. The flow of water surface does not go through the Sackett's property, but this wetland was part of this wetland, i.e. nexus, i.e. navigable waters. But this Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Sacketts, that they were allowed to do that. And that distance, this distance from the Sackett wetlands to the lake is 1,000 feet. So 3 years ago, significant nexus was almost 3,000 feet. Supreme Court was good with that, but change in court membership 3 years later, now it's not. Even though arguably this one has much more of a superficial connection. Yes. I think that was part, yeah. Yeah, I think that was part of the consideration that the judges went through when the trial was held, right? Because if you, let's see, so if we've got a, all right. So if we've got a wetland, right? So here's our wetland, and you build a road that goes through the wetland, right? We've got all the plants coming up in the wetland over here. We've got all the plants in the wetland coming up over here. All right, so the question then becomes, so when you build a road, you don't just lay down some asphalt on some wetland. You've got to build a road bed. And that road bed is going to go down some distance. And the question is this distance enough to cut off the flow of water? That's your question, yes? I don't know the answer to that question. If that road bed is deep enough to cut off flow of water. Because, and ultimately it may not even matter, because if you as a judge don't consider the path that groundwater can travel as part of a navigable water, then it almost doesn't matter. Does that make sense? So very different interpretation of the same rules. And yeah, so that's where we are. And so with that, I think that's the last slide I had. Yep, that's the last slide I had. Did I have more slides for you guys after those two judicial slides? All right, well, then that's all I've got. So I am happy to go back and talk about anything else that anyone wants to go back and talk about, or we can just call this one early and go on. The other environment. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So for the exam, I would say be able to talk about any one of these and compare it to one of our big five. NEPA, Clean Air, Clean Water, CERCLA, ESA. Does that sound okay? All right. Sure, you are absolutely welcome to check your little factoids with me. Yeah. All right. Have a great weekend, everyone.